eyes may be able to see, but without a heart, you cannot feel.
What's up, everybody? This is Siosi, and you are tuning into episode 100 of the It Will Come show. And today we're going to be talking about why and how you should stop using starting with why, or why you should start with who versus starting with why when it comes to building communities. And so today, let's dive straight in. All right. So, why you should start with who, not why, when building communities. And since it is episode 100, congrats to us all for getting to episode number 100. And so this session was actually inspired by an article that I came across just recently by Michael Buckman. And now actually I searched for anybody who would actually come up with start with who. So as I've been building communities professionally over the years, I actually noticed that starting with who when it comes to building communities was actually much better than starting with why. And the start with why actually came from a guy named Sinek, who I'll talk a little bit more about soon. But yeah, essentially, when it comes to community building, the better question to ask is who versus why. And so we'll dive into this. So what we'll cover today is first Simon Sinek, who he is and his relation to start with why versus who. Two, who are you solving for when it comes to building communities? What do you value as a community? Who do you want to become as a community? What are your boundaries as a community? And then revising the golden circle, that is a concept that Simon Sinek has came up with. So, Simon Sinek, start with why. So if you're not familiar with Simon Sinek, he's this consultant who became very popular for his TED Talk called Start With Why. And so he also bought a book. And in terms of thought leadership, this became a great way for him to be able to consult around this particular methodology. Now, for the most part, it is pretty good because of its simplicity, right? But there is a fundamental flaw, and I won't say with the model itself, but just in terms of when you should apply this versus not. So in Simon Sinek's golden circle, so this is the golden circle, you start with why, then how, then what, and you move onwards that way. So as you can see here at the bottom, it says, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it, which is partially true. And the why is usually around sort of your vision or your ideal. But there's certain situations where you cannot always start with why. So first up, the founder's dilemma. So the founder's dilemma is really more about when you've got an idea and when you're just starting out. Sometimes you don't always know why you're doing a particular thing or why you even exist as a product, as a service, etc. All you're looking to solve is a potential problem. And with that problem, who are you solving that problem for? Generally, I've heard many successful entrepreneurs start their entrepreneurial journey with these particular words. There's got to be a better way. And so when a founder asks themselves this question, it becomes more about them solving their own problem. And as a result of solving their own problem, they then attract people with similar problems. And the reason why it's a lot more powerful is because the founder is able to internalize that problem, right? And so he can speak better to others who also have the same problems. Then after they've attracted more people who have similar problems, they're able to grow a following around that, right? Because in the process of them finding a way to solve, said problem, other people become interested, right? Other people start following that journey. And, then number 4, they don't often know their why, but they definitely know who, because the who is themselves, right? Next up, the question to ask, right, is what do you value? And so this can be a personal problem, which then relates to the community that you end up attracting. But this goes around values and purpose. So generally, when it comes to community building, it's far easier to actually set out values for yourself and your community than it is to lay out the purpose of why you exist, right? And I've got a few examples here on the right. So at the top, can you identify which community this belongs to? If you manage to think of Burning Man, you would be correct. And if you're not familiar with Burning Man, it is a community of people who every year there's this massive festival, and people from all over the world come and just essentially be free, right? There are set principles around Burning Man, and most people know them, and they become very well known for it, right? And next up, on the second image, are you able to identify who that is? If you guessed Lululemon, you would be correct. And very simply, you can see there, yoga, run, party, their values are quite clear generally. So even though they are a brand, you might even know what they are a brand for. You'll hear more about actually their very strong community. And so most people will know the values of Lululemon versus why they exist. And then finally, you got here, right, a national community, right, the United States. So for Americans, generally you'll know what they stand for: liberty, justice, and the pursuit of freedom. And this is, right, this is going to be something that Americans and even those outside of America would be able to answer, as opposed to like, why do Americans exist, or why does that particular community exist, right? And just as a personal example in terms of these values, right? So I'm just giving a personal example of a movie that I watched not too long ago called It's a Wonderful Life. And they kind of highlight this, right? The reason for the main character, George Bailey, as pictured here, for existing is kind of unknown even to himself. He does all of these things for everybody else, sometimes at the detriment of his own success and happiness. But he definitely has these strong values, and they are reflected in his relationships. He definitely is able. He values community. He values people, and as a result, in the end of this film, that is reflected back. And his measure of success is in all the people that he has helped, versus just the financial gains that were values of another individual or a banker, right? So the values for this other banker was essentially money, and that was reflected too in his actions. And so the community that formed around George Bailey also valued relationships. Next, becoming. So who do you want to become? This applies both at an individual level and also as a community. If you are a business or a brand looking to create a community, start with yourself, usually the founder, and then expand out to, okay, if you're wanting to build out a community, and if you were to attach a persona type to that community, who would you like to become as that community, right? So let's look at some examples. Brazil. A lot of times when you think of a Brazilian or even the people of Brazil, of course there are a lot of different types of people, right? But as a whole, they have a persona. And generally you will think of that in your mind when picturing Brazilians. They're fans of football, and they're very much known for their feeling abilities. They're very people who love to hug. If you to look at their love language, it would definitely be physical touch. And if you're not familiar with love languages, highly recommend you check out the 5 love languages on Google. And there's a certain persona that will be summed up, right, for the Brazilians. Next up, you got the Maoris from New Zealand, right? Generally, you'll think about these, you think about the haka from rugby, and generally they'll be very proud of that as part of their culture, and they are a warrior culture. So that is something that they carry with them. Now, of course, there are different sub-communities and different cultural differences, but on the whole, this is what you might think about the Maori people generally, right? Strong, fierce warrior types. And then finally, if you want to look at more of the business brand aspect, Apple fans, right? There's definitely a community of Apple fans and supporters whereby, this was definitely a conscious decision from Apple And I think even Guy Kawasaki, when building out the community, who do you want them to become, right? And as a brand, you wanted to have that like sort of loyal following, right? Fans who would essentially line up outside Apple stores to buy their products. People who would be proud, people who would be cool, young, hip, right? These were very conscious decisions that were tied to the values of the community. Next up, boundaries, right? I call this a furnace for the fire. So what boundaries do you want to implement for your community, right? And with this, from the community side, you'll see that lower right, you've got the 10 Commandments, just using that as an example. And with the 10 Commandments, that actually sets the boundaries for the community. So this is what sort of places who you want in the community versus not. And this is the irony sometimes, because people talk about like inclusive communities. Well, it's inclusive to a point, right? Because generally you would want people included in your community that fit your values, right? And who you want to be around, versus like, say you don't want evil wrongdoers, right? You don't want bad actors in your community. So it is exclusive in that instance or perspective. So when I say furnace for the fire, it's looking at your community as sort of the fire itself. And the furnace allows that fire to be able to grow and warm, as opposed to grow and destroy. Without these creative boundaries, right? Without these furnaces, communities are susceptible to growing to a point of destruction or destroying themselves. You could potentially look at this in the United States as well, because of maybe the lax boundaries here and there, or maybe the confusion around what the boundaries are. You're seeing, I think in Detroit or Boston somewhere right now, there is an autonomous zone being created, right? People wanting to create their own, their own community within a larger one. Now, the golden circle, as we had touched upon it at the beginning of this session, right? If we were to start with why, you can see there on the left, Simon Sinek's version. Well, you'll have this issue where you don't necessarily know why you exist or why you want to exist, but you might know who. And so on the right, you can see start with who. This is much easier, especially if you are solving your own problem. Because if you're looking to build a community, you're actually going to go, well, actually, I'm solving this problem for myself. So I am going to build a community of folks who also share in this same problem that I'm trying to solve, right? Far easier. And so I would recommend, for those watching, if you've been struggling with the start with why that Simon Sinek has, formulated, I would suggest that you start with who instead. This may be a lot easier. This is focused more on people-oriented businesses, and definitely community-driven businesses. And of course, not forgetting all the other questions that come into play when you're building a business or community, right? You still need to ask yourself the what, the how, the why, the when, the where, on top of who, right? It's just that in terms of if you are getting stuck at the beginning, it might be because you're asking the wrong question. And you need to also take into account the type of entrepreneur you are. In this session, I haven't talked about something called the Wealth Dynamics Square, but in another session, I may talk about that, whereby if you understand sort of what your entrepreneurial style is, then out of all of these questions, there are actually certain questions that are better suited to you in terms of answering. So the who question generally is focused on the type of entrepreneur that is building a business that is people-driven or community-driven. The why sits in sort of the middle of all of them. But you might, if you are somebody who's building a product-driven business, then you may be asking more of the what, right? That might be a much easier question for you to answer. If you are building a business that's more sensory, that is more based on the where, right? So if you have a physical location-based business, brick and mortar, or maybe commercial property, co-working spaces, then the where and the when might actually be more relevant. So again, there's another layer element to this, that you need to understand your style, type of business you're building, and then asking the right question based on that. So finally, I leave this with you. who are you, right? Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be just a community-driven or business-related question, right? This might be a more existential, a more personal question that relates to you. But at this point in time, and for this particular session, one, who are you? And then who do you want to become, right? Because that may very well dictate how your community grows. And finally, what are your thoughts? Would love to hear what you think, or how you think you're going to become, or who you're going to become in the future, right? And then if you have a community that you're looking to build, or even if you have an already existing community, who do you want to become together with others? Comment below. Remember to like and subscribe. And as always, remember, through patience and persistence, it will come.
The eyes may be able to see, but without a heart, you cannot.